Brought to you by CGTN Europe.
Hello and welcome to this week's Razor podcast. I'm Shini and Emma.
And I'm Emma Keeling. Today on the podcast, we continue to look at life after COVID-19.
I mean, I always say that the world's worst ever nuclear accident has done less damage to the ecosystem than people just going about their daily business.
I know I just said life after, but, most of us are still very much living life during COVID, aren't we, Shini? But did you have a nice holiday, more importantly?
Yeah, it was good. But, not knowing what's going on with COVID, how we handle it, really influenced the holiday. Earlier in the year, we looked at the Anthropause, a term referring to the worldwide slowing down of human activity, which has led to many animals venturing further afield as we retreated inside. This term was coined by Dr. Christian Rutz from the University of St Andrews, all the way back in episode 12 of the Razor podcast.
One of the interesting interviews that I did for that story was with Professor Prof Smith from the University of Portsmouth. He explained how this Anthropause relates to studies of the Chernobyl disaster and how nature has responded in the wake of the 1986 nuclear meltdown there.
But what are the parallels between Anthropause and what happened at Chernobyl?
Well, it's the fact that take the humans out of the equation and, what do you know, all the animals want to come back out and have a good old time in the wild. So last time we spoke about this story, you only heard a little snippet of my interview, but we thought we would share the whole thing right here. So please enjoy. Jim, first of all, just tell us about your research in Chernobyl. When did you actually start?
Well, I started researching the Chernobyl accident in 1990 when I was a PhD student studying radioactivity in the English Lake District, because we got some fallout from Chernobyl here. And I first went to visit the exclusion zone in 1994. And then we were studying where the radioactivity went in the ecosystem. So how much went into rivers, fish, different elements of the ecosystem. But more recently, in the last sort of 10, 15 years, we've been studying whether the radioactivity has had an impact on the wildlife in the exclusion zone, so the abandoned area around Chernobyl, and what's happening in that abandoned area.
And so what is happening now? How has the wildlife adapted and changed?
Well, what actually Belarusian and Ukrainian, so the exclusion zone, half of it is in Belarus and half of it is in Ukraine. Chernobyl, the site is on the border. And just a few years after the accident, Belarusian and Ukrainian scientists noticed that the species associated with humans, so things like pigeons and rats, were disappearing because the humans had disappeared, and wild species were coming back. So we expect to see some subtle effects of radiation in some of the hot spots in the exclusion zone. We expect to see some subtle effects, and we have seen some subtle effects. But now, 30 years on, the radioactivity is more than 100 times lower than it was right after the accident. And the wildlife seem to be coping very well and doing even better because the people aren't there.
So they're adapting better to radiation than humans. I mean, humans are worse than radiation.
Well, yes. I mean, I always say that the world's worst ever nuclear accident has done less damage to the ecosystem than people just going about their daily business. So before the accident, obviously there were two towns. There was a population of over 100,000 people. It's a huge area for Europe. It's a huge abandoned area. It's about 4,000 square kilometers. And just before the accident, people were doing what people do, which is to chop down trees and do forestry, do fishing, hunting, agriculture. All these things, just humans occupying a space, does enormous damage to an ecosystem, unfortunately. And the fact that there's residual radiation there doesn't seem to bother the populations of animals and plants. It's the benefit of not having us there anymore that's caused a wildlife explosion.
So are you seeing animals that are really seen, if ever, in the area? Are they coming back in force?
Yeah. I mean, the first recorded increases were on things like wild boar, who have a fast multiplication rate, so they reproduce quickly, and their populations grew very quickly. Elk, roe deer, wolves increased, And things like lynx, which were very rare before the accident, because people weren't collecting data, particularly before the accident. But in that region, we understand that before the accident, things like lynx were very rare. A white-tailed eagle, black stork, they weren't there before the accident, but after the accident, they've come back, and even lynx have been spotted in the abandoned town of Pripyat, which is just next to the power station.
Do you think the Anthropause is an important opportunity to measure human impact?
Well, I think it is, and it's really challenging. Of course, these are dramatic events. Chernobyl was a terrible disaster, and mainly from the evacuation and the socio-economic effects that had probably outweighed the direct radiation risk to the people, but it definitely had a massive effect on the human population. Obviously, COVID-19 is having a massive effect on people's lives. And, it's clear that if we really want to make a big difference to how animal habitats and providing more habitats to animals, then we have to accept quite a big difference to our own lives.
So this is a brand new segment where Shini and I look at two stories that have been exciting us in the world of science. So Shini, you go first because you're fresh from holiday, and so you're going to have been reading up the entire time you've been away.
Of course. But yeah, I think because I was away and I was very much looking at science on a broader spectrum. For me, the science that I found most interesting recently is the blurring of science and art, particularly in the field of artificial intelligence. And there was an article in The American Scientist, and it was headlined, "AI is blurring the definition of artist." And the article really opens up a whole sort of can of worms of how science and art can coexist, because, artificial intelligence can spot patterns and can create art based on learning from art that's already been made. But once that art has been created, how are we as humans supposed to interpret it, price it, own it? I mean, there are just so many questions that get thrown up by this very disruptive technology.
There are so many facets to this. And you're right, it's so fascinating because I guess initially it's like, well, it just goes to show that we're so much closer than maybe a lot of people believe, that just because we're on other sides of the planet doesn't mean we're somehow connected, and it goes back a long way. But it just sort of brings another level of how you enjoy art or how you experience art as well.
So Emma, what have you got?
Well, mine's a bit of a cheat, I've got to be honest, because the most exciting thing that happened this week was that I got to leave the house and actually go and film a story. So where I went to Entocycle, and this is so good. And this is going to be it's a growing story, I guess you could say. So Entocycle harvest black soldier fly larvae. And I actually saw an article this week which was talking about how much this industry is going to be worth. So by 2030, the black fly larvae, because it's all about protein. We need this extra protein because there's so many more billion of us going to be on the planet. And by 2030, this industry is going to be worth about $2.57 billion US. And so what's kind of cool about this is that what these guys are doing is, and I think other places around the world are doing this too, is that they're growing and harvesting these larvae, and you dry them and you can grind them down into a meal. It's like a protein meal, and then you can give it to the animals. And what we're trying to stop here is the deforestation that's being done so we can plant more crops, and also all the plundering of our oceans, because we're not only catching shellfish and fish for us to eat, we're also catching smaller fish so we can feed the aquaculture as well. So what they're saying here is that here's another source of protein that's really sustainable. I mean, you can grow this in a facility. And these little guys, they just eat waste, like human food waste. So, veggies, even meat, you can chuck all this stuff, coffee grounds, beer, the stuff that the grains from beer, you can chuck all that. They just munch through those, and they grow nice and fat, and then they kill them off, and then they grind them down. And It's lots of amino acids. It's hypoallergenic. So lots of really good things going on. So we went along to the facility. There was a bit of a smell, I must say. A lot of ammonia in the air, which clung to the clothes on the way out. I thought people on the train might back off, but
Thank God
I was
everyone was
okay.
wearing masks when you were.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's pretty fragrant, but weirdly, like anything, you just sort of suddenly get used to the smell. But it did clear out my sinuses, so that was another bonus from this trip.
So it's actual larvae, fly larvae.
You grind it all up, so it's like a protein flour. So these black soldier flies, they lay the eggs and then they hatch. And after a couple of weeks, the larvae get to a certain size that they're nice and plump, and you can kill them off. And I won't tell you, because I was dared by Paul, the cameraman, who you know very well. He said, "I dare you to eat one." And I'm not gonna ruin it. I'm not gonna tell you whether I ate it or not. You're gonna have to watch the episode. All right, it's time to wrap things up, but let's hear from Jim one more time.
I think it shows that it is quite difficult to have make a big difference to ecosystems when humans are there. Britain is a very densely populated country by global standards, and we see that in Britain. There aren't really any true natural ecosystems in Britain, and we have to learn to kind of coexist. And we've done that more or less successfully in different areas. And these are the lessons we've got to learn, is how we can, we've got a population increases of humans. We're expected to reach 9 billion by 2050. And how can we coexist with wildlife and give them more habitat? And there are difficult decisions to be made about that. Do we try and intensify, put more of the human population in cities, have more intensive agriculture to leave more space for wildlife? Or do we try and have the human activity more spread out but coexist with wildlife? These are really tough decisions, and we need the science to make those decisions. We tend to think about our impact on the environment in terms of pollution, in terms of CO2, in terms of metal pollution of the ocean and these things. But actually, one of our biggest impacts on the environment is just being there, doing the things that we do every day. And I think Chernobyl is certainly an incredible example of what happens when you take away the people.
That's it for another edition of Razor. Remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Also, if you want to see the videos from some of these stories, go to CGTN Europe and type in Razor.
Until next time, bye.